Have you ever wondered what's on the inside of the walls of this building? Well, in this episode, we're going to find out. Welcome to another episode of Flightline Museum, Remembering Canadian Aviation History. In this episode, the National Airforce Museum of Canada. And this museum is found at CFB Trenton in Trenton, Ontario, Canada. And CFB Trenton, by the way, is the largest Canadian Air Force base. And as we zoom in, you can find the location of the museum. And upon entry, this is the admissions desk. They'll be glad to take you in. And here we have the floor plan for both the upper and the lower floor plans. So what we're going to do is start on the main floor. This is where most of the aircraft on the inside are stationed, especially the Halifax bomber, which is the centerpiece. This example of a Halifax bomber from World War II, the Mark 7, is in fantastic shape. But in order to get it that way, it has taken thousands and thousands and more thousands of man hours to lovingly restore this aircraft back to its original state, although it is not flyable. From the outside and from the cockpit area, it is basically what you would have had during World War II, right from one end to the other, including the Browning machine guns that can be found in the tail section, the paint scheme that is adorning it. As I said, this is the centerpiece of the museum. And I believe it is one of the very few Halifax bombers that is on display in any museum anywhere in the world. This particular bomber was retrieved from a lake in Norway and brought here, and has been restored, and it is just fantastic to see what can be done. And yet you have to think of the young men that used to fly in these during the war. The last flight, it's an interesting story to hear about its Flight Sergeant Thomas Whiteman, who was the rear gunner, the only survivor. And he was located right there in that turret. And when this was brought out of the water in 1995, his thermos was still in the rear turret that he escaped from. Again, we'll take a good look at some of this bomber, including what it was, a bomber. And taking a look at the ordnance that's there, you can get an idea that it could carry a good amount of bombs. Unlike its sister, the Lancaster, it does not receive as much fanfare, and many Canadians flew this aircraft during World War II. Now we'll take one last look at the main floor, at the different aircraft that are here, and what we will do is take the time in a moment to go through each of these aircraft and see what each of them is and how they've been restored to be on display here at the National Aviation or National Air Force Museum in Trenton, Ontario. Starting with the Silver Dart replica. It's a replica of the first aircraft in the British Commonwealth that flew at Quebec, Nova Scotia. And Alexander Graham Bell had a big part in that. Then we move on, still in the same kind of era. And it's the Burgess Dunn's delivery aircrew, the Burgess Dunn's aircraft. Again, you'll note the Canadian red ensign in the back. Dragonfly, one of the first helicopters that Canada acquired, was used both by the Army, Air Force, and the Navy. This is a little newer, the Spruer, what they called the flying Skidoo, because it had the same engine as what a Skidoo did as a drone during the Afghan War. The Avro Anson, completely made of wood, including wooden propellers, built in Canada, and it was obsolete at the beginning of the war and became a basic trainer. A newer trainer would be the Chipmunk. You start off on this and work your way up. There's all kinds of artifacts can be found on both floors. And if you're looking for engines, there are plenty of those. All different types of what have been used, especially the Avro Canada Orenda 11 that should have been in one of the best fighters or interceptors of the Cold War, the CF 105, but it never happened. And there's some other things to take a look at, such as the cockpit here of a CF 101. All the RCAF squadron badges are on display, and you can see most of them, or all of them, right here. So now that we've been on the main floor and looked at the aircraft, let's take a look at the second floor. As we focus in, first thing we're going to look at is the British Commonwealth Air Training Program, and there is a huge display here because Canada became known as the Aerodrome of Democracy during World War II, and a good deal of flight training was done in the local area here. Starting with the Harvard, the Advanced Trainer, retractable undergear, very maneuverable, and there are still quite a few of these flying today. An aircraft similar to it is the Yale, but one of the biggest differences in the Yale, less power, had a fixed undercarriage. And again, as I mentioned, Canada was the Aerodrome of Democracy, and there's a link trainer of what was at that time very advanced. Again, many artifacts that can be found here in order of years. And a nice one of Billy Bishop, our best World War I ace. One of the aircraft at the other end, the Oster, which was an observation and reconnaissance aircraft. We'll end our tour of the inside of the building with the Camp Mirage Monument. This monument was brought back from Camp Mirage that contains the names of those that fell during the Afghan War from Canada. Okay, let's head out to the air park. And I'm sorry that things are a little fuzzy here because I'm taking the picture from inside the building, and a little bit of glare on the window itself made it hard to focus outside. But you can see there are quite a few aircraft outside. Again, there's a floor plan, if you'd like to call it that, of the air park itself. And we will go through almost every one of the aircraft, beginning with this little view from down below, that you get a look at the differences of the aircraft, what the grounds are like as we pan around through. And we're going to do this several times throughout this video. And that brings us around. This is the end. This is the Jewish Memorial. So the building itself on the outside, and we will start with the CP-121 tracker. And one of the things you will note as we go through this with aircraft that are outside in Canada's environment, you will find the paint does not last very well and has to be continually checked. As you can look at the tracker, it has really started to peel. So we'll move through here. Off to the left, you'll see some of the firefighting equipment. We'll touch on that a little bit later on. But as we move through to the path, you'll notice there are bricks on either side. And these bricks are memorial bricks that people can purchase for memorials to service personnel or those that have an interest in the military and the services. and that helps to pay for the restoration of the aircraft. And there are quite a few of them. The next aircraft we're going to look at is the CT-114 Tudor. This is a training aircraft built in 1963 originally, and it's still used by Canada Snowbirds as their main and only aerobatic aircraft. The Twin Huey, made famous in Vietnam, not by us, but by the Americans, as it became one of their stalwarts of that era. This particular Huey has the UN white colors and the UN symbol on the side of it, and that's what it was basically used for at this particular time, as Canada had been known as the peacekeeping nation. The Beechcraft CT-144 Musketeer, again a training aircraft. Another training aircraft that people forget about is the Silver Star, or the CT-133, and even though this is not silver and painted in our gray, it served a long time as a training aircraft. As I said, some firefighting equipment. The Beechcraft Expediter. This particular Expediter, this type, was part of training command, but also to carry equipment and supplies, especially into small airfields. Now, looking from the Silver Star and the Expediter, we'll take a look at some of the other aircraft just off to the side. And here's one of the biggest ones, our CP-107 Canadian-made Argus, which during the Cold War was one of the greatest sub-hunters that you could find, because it could last up to 30 hours, and it has done that during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you want to learn more about the Argus and what it's done, check out Flightline Museum's Teaching and Preserving the Importance of the Argus, which is basically about the Greenwood Military Aviation Museum and everything it has done to help preserve aviation history. Speaking of aviation history that was not part of Canada, the Hawker Hunter. And this was donated by the Swiss Air Force in 1975, the last year that they were flown. It was used extensively by the British and the Swiss and played a key role during the Cold War. So let's move away from the Hunter. And we're going to take a look at the CF-188, or commonly known as the CF-18 Hornet. Very sleek, and the Hornet still is Canada's premier fighter jet. Prior to that, the CF-101 Voodoo, which was an interceptor, two-person interceptor. And this is American built, and it was bought from the Americans, and it replaced the CF-100s that we'll look at a little later. Now, getting into some of the larger aircraft and some of the more stranger looking aircraft. As we move through, and just on cue, we had a flyover by a couple of Hercules as part of their training session. So let's take a look at the Hercules. The one on display is a C-130E model Hercules, and the one above it is a J model Hercules. This particular Hercules came from CFB Greenwood, that was used there as part of search and rescue. And moving from that particular Hercules, we're going to take a look at this strange looking bird, the Boeing 720. It was basically used as a test bed by Pratt & Whitney for the engines. And its last flight was here to Trenton, where it was donated to the National Aviation or National Air Force Museum. As we move over now, we're going to take a look at a CP-140 Aurora. It's the one that replaced the Argus as a sub-hunter, as a reconnaissance, surveillance aircraft, and Canada still flies this aircraft. It was a derivative of the P-3 Oron, and it is coming to its life's end, the Auroras, to be replaced by a new aircraft, and that will be the Poseidon. The newest collection, or newest part to the collection, is the Buffalo, or the Buff. This was used until several years ago in British Columbia as a search and rescue aircraft. Canadian built, great design. It is a remarkable aircraft, but its time has come and it has been retired and flown in here, and it now is on display. So, speaking of helicopters, and helicopters have been around for a while, it's the CH-134 Sea King. And it started in 1963 and was not replaced until approximately 5 years ago. So this particular aircraft was flown here from CFB Shearwater. The Challenger aircraft, this one on display was one of the last four of the fleet, has been brought in and has been sitting here ever since. And sorry about the fact that things didn't turn out as bright as they should. We also have our control room. The Sabre, some call it the F-86 in Canada, had a different name. It was built under contract by Canadair. You'll note 6 50 caliber machine guns on the front of it, and it had been in service until the early 1970s. Again, there's our CF-18, some other equipment. You get an idea just how big this park is. Oh yes, and there are plenty of monuments around too, to different organizations. The Chinook, this particular Chinook, flew in Afghanistan for the Canadian military and has been brought here and been sitting here ever since. This gives you a little bit better view of the Hornet as we pan through. And then we move through to 2 replicas, a Mark 9 Spitfire and a Mark 2 Hurricane, both Battle of Britain aircraft, if you so wish. Moving over to an Iroquois, and you'll notice it's in the search and rescue mode. So let's take a look at some of these aircraft, especially these replicas. The Hurricane, although it's not as famous as the Spitfire, actually shot down more aircraft during World War II in the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire did. And it continued into production until 1944. The Spitfire that is not the same as the marks that were in the Battle of Britain, but has been put together quite well to represent a Mark 9. All right. Speaking of search and rescue, and moving it through, oh, there's an aircraft we never flew. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the missile with a man in it. So let's go back and take a look. This is the CH-113 Labrador. And this particular aircraft had served tremendously for the Canadian Armed Forces, and it could even land in water if it had to. The MiG-21, or fish bed, this was donated by the German government after reunification, and this is one of the primary aircraft of the Cold War on the Soviet side. The Dakota, you can call it a C-47 or a DC-3. This one represents the Canucks Unlimited DC-3 the Canadian Air Force used during World War II flying supplies for the British. This is the CF-100, and this is one of the ones that if you want to learn more, the Lynx Squadron, the CF-100 years, would be just what you want to do. And here we have the Freedom Fighter which was flown by many countries throughout the world. This one is painted in the 416 Moose Squadron, and the red and white is the colors of Canada. 4D Mark I starfighter. This particular one was the last starfighter to fly in Canada. It just like The Last Starfighter, but not the same as the movie The Last Starfighter. In order to make things work, you have to have restoration and you have to be ready for the future. And out back of the building, we have some restoration going on with the Red Knights and the Golden Centurions, which were aerobatic groups. Speaking of restoration, and here's the biggest one happening right now. This aircraft used to be outside Edmundston, New Brunswick, and it was being ready to be scrapped if it wasn't repaired. So it was taken apart and it was shipped here to the National Air Force Museum, and it now sits inside the restoration area that you can view by going in. And this will give you an idea of just what they're doing, and take a look how meticulous the work is being done on this particular aircraft. And when completed, the museum will be the only one with a complete Lancaster and Halifax bomber on display. So thank you for taking the time to go through. Do try to get out to museums, support them. It will be greatly appreciated by all. And please check out the other videos in the Flightline Museum collection. We would really appreciate you taking a look and learning a little bit more about aviation history.